Today, people picture the Templars as symbols or bankers from c. 1120 to 1291. They were heavy cavalry whose vows, gear, and tactics broke lines. If that clashes with what you've heard, evidence suggests a harsher truth. Otherwise, the myth stays. You miss how fear formation and faith won and lost battles. What made a few hundred riders a sight of enemies dreaded? Galilee, 1187. After Gerard de Ridefort's rash clash at Cresson, the Crusader host crawled beneath a sun that felt like kiln fire heat and choking smoke, made every march a punished prayer. The Templars rode out of that ordeal as they always had, disciplined, ritualized, and terrifying to enemies who met them in open ground. Their black and white bowsient flew like a divided sky, a torn rally point amid dust and flame. William of Tyre and later writers describe their appearance as a symbol, and a threat. Ibn al-Athir records how their capture at Hattin brought a bitter, violent reckoning. They fought by habit and by rule. In camp and in the saddle, the order enforced drill habitus, and the rules, strictures, horse harness, and habit were managed like a chapel's vessels. When duty called, squadrons formed into eshils, each lance spoke in a compact offensive wheel. Lances were couched, shields locked, and marshals kept rank so that a single thunderous charge could cleave a line. Turcopoles, light cavalry drawn from local levies, screened flanks and skirmished, while foot sergeants held the banner and brought up infantry support when walls or hedgerows broke the push. Their fearsome reputation rested on three pillars that met at Hattin: aggressive shock, sustained discipline, and logistics that kept them mounted and mobile. The order's forges ran day, and night. Remount herds and armories meant a brother could re-equip faster than most noblemen could. Warehouses and ship links in port cities fed campaigns, inland turning piety into predictable power. When lances met mail, the sound was a single terrible chime, iron on iron, and the sight of a mantled white brother driving into enemy ranks stopped casual foes. At Hattin, those strengths clashed with ruinous circumstances. Parched men stumbled, horses stuttered and collapsed beneath exhausted riders. The Templars charged again and again through a sleet of arrows, each eshil pushing like an iron plow, only to find the plain opening into pits of smoke and brushfires set by Saladin's men. Eyes stung, the smell of singed leather and unbreathable ash hung heavy. Discipline held longer than hope, but supplies failed and maneuver became attrition. Their bowsient, once a point of order, became a torn beacon amid chaos. What turned steel discipline into ruin? At Hattin it was thirst and encirclement, not lack of courage. When chargers no longer rose and waterskins lay empty, captains could not restore a shattered strategic picture. Captured brothers suffered a grim fate that deepened dread across Outremer. Ibn al-Athir notes the execution of some captured Templars and Hospitallers, an act that hardened hatred and fear on both sides. The consequence was immediate and catastrophic. The inland realm bled out as castles surrendered one by one. Yet the seacoast still bristled with garrison towers and supply lines. The Templars would not vanish. They would learn that future battles would be fought at walls and trenches, and before engines of siegecraft rather than in open wedges. The inland kingdom smoked. The next great trials would be sieges that tested stores, seamanship, and the fragile thread of Western aid. In Acre and Cyprus, in the years after the Third Crusade, the Knights Templar became as much an office as an army. Ledgers clicked beneath vaulted halls, and training yards sent up the smell of boiled leather and splintering ash. What made them so feared? The answer lay in the marriage of rule, horse, and cold procedure. William of Tyre had praised their zeal. Now that zeal was turned into an industrial warcraft that fed itself from European coin and the sea. Commanders decided to bind men by vow and system. New brethren entered under a rule that set hours of prayer, and the exacting penalties for failure. Marshals kept drill to a public tempo. In practice, this meant a clear chain from purveyors to smiths, from remount herds to the trumpet call that released reserves. In camp, the marshal's horn summoned squadrons to couch lances behind them. Sergeants and turcopoles, local light horse, learned to screen and sting to harry flanks and fall back under heavy blows. The temple's storehouses on Cyprus became depots of male fodder and iron. A single remount herd could include as many as 40 fresh chargers at a season of plenty. When the Fifth Crusade turned to Egypt, the temple's competence showed in bridges and siege platforms raised by organized labor rather than improvised zeal. Engineers taught by custom and habit erected mantlets and towers. The Templar storm parties moved as rehearsed units toward Damietta's walls. Ibn al-Athir records that the river's floods and the fever that followed broke the campaign's momentum as surely as a broken bridge. Their tactics were not mere brute force but doctrine. Heavy cavalry fought in echelon, and by timed release a frontal weight to fix a reserve to smash, then a mounted pursuit to rout. Foot brothers, armored clerics and sergeants, held the banner and cut lanes for retreat. This disciplined choreography terrified opponents who expected either chaotic charging or cautious siegecraft. The temple gave both in a single, coldly efficient machine. In the shingle courts of Acre, their carpenters could within a week fashion a platform that carried a couched shock 3 times heavier than an ordinary feudal host could sustain. Yet rigidity bred risks. Discipline enforced obedience, but made improvisation slow. A compact chain of command could not always absorb the tide of pestilence, bad grain supplies, or political quarrels among kings and popes. In Cyprus, the order's fortresses and estates sheltered refugees and coin, yet the same centralization made them a tempting target for princes who wanted revenue or governors who feared autonomous power. The brothers' refusal to open Jerusalem's gates for a treaty reflected a rule-bound prudence that also widened divisions between Rome emperors and local barons. Their presence kept the coast garrisoned, their training rings echoed with splintering ash, and their banners reassured pilgrims. Still, as papal designs outran grain as river and fever put space between commanders and aims, the order's habitual certainty began to show thin seams. A treaty would soon hand Jerusalem back without its walls, and the brothers' unity would be tested by rival claims and dwindling stores. Jerusalem and Gaza stand as stage and wound in this tale after the emperor rode into the holy city by accord. What happens when vows meet treaties? Matthew Paris records papal outrage at the bargain and the Templars' refusal to open their houses to an emperor under sentence from Rome. Obedience to the papal curia, fear of imperial shadow, and the order's rule held sway. Faith and law shaped steel as surely as lance and stirrup. The Templars chose discipline over diplomacy. Their decision grew from a rule that made brothers both monk and man-at-arms. Spiritual obedience regulated war. In consequence, they kept citadel doors closed even as a volatile sea of mercenaries and refugees gathered beyond the walls. The order's forces were organized for shock-heavy squadrons formed in compact echelons, foot sergeants, guarding the banner, and turcopoles screening flanks and pursuing broken foe. Warehouses, forges, and remount herds bound faith to logistics, but obedience to Rome could not summon fresh allies when caravans of exiles and hired horsemen darkened the southern plains. Then the Khwarezmians descended, mounted men from the eastern wastes, fierce and unanchored. Jerusalem, filled with smoke and shrieks, the air carried the acrid tang of burning timber and blood. With the temple houses barred, few defenders could meet the onrush inside the city, and the sanctuaries were profaned and emptied in a single terrible night. Pilgrims and citizens fled or were slain. The sight of black crosses and white mantles in the streets became a memory of loss. The sack announced a new era of brutality and roaming bands that no treaty could bind. Soon after, at La Fourbe, on a hard sandy plain north of Gaza, the orders took the field in force. The Latin host and its Syrian allies arrayed their levy, while the military orders formed the center. The brothers rode down in disciplined, impact-heavy lances, couched mantles billowing, and for a moment they cleft an enemy wing. Their charge broke ranks, horses plunging through mail, and shields. Their steadiness on the field struck terror into the Khwarezmians and Egyptians alike. Yet discipline became rigid. With few reserves and limited mounting men left in hand, the orders could not exploit the breach. As the day wore, Allied contingents wavered and fled. The Latin center found itself encircled by masses of horse and foot. Surrounded, cut off from fresh men-at-arms, and from retreat the brothers held the standard until it fell. The orders had mustered roughly 312 knights for the field, a standing corps rare in Christendom, but the number alone could not answer the tide. Survivors were counted in the dozens. Many houses of the military orders were shattered. The consequence was swift, and savage the frontier-bled castles stood lonelier, and heirs at home heard of a defeat as grave as Hattin. A saint king in the west began to gather ships for Egypt. The Nile would once more test iron and will. The question hangs, who will answer the sea when the shore can no longer supply men and horses? The Nile Delta 1240, 1254 closes like a trap around the white mantles of the temple. Towers and bridges press forward at Mansoura. Town alleys become blooded mazes when Robert of Artois bursts the vanguard and cannot stop. The strategic aim was simple: seize the river road, force a march on Cairo, and end Ayyubid resistance, where the kingdom's grain and fleet met. Logistics decided otherwise. Silted canals, summer heat, and a host stretched thin by ships and stores made commanders choose caution that young nobles would not keep. The Templars answered that danger with what had made them feared since Jerusalem, a rule that bound monk and cavalry training, that turned horses into weapons, and a moral obligation to hold the line. When Robert rushed, the marshal of the temple ordered, formed rearguards and countershocks to close gaps. Men in white mantles couched lance upon lance, kneeling into impact to carve corridors through grappling foes, so infantry could withdraw in order. The sight was stark: pennons black and white hooves beating mud, iron scraping stone. A metallic tang of blood and river brine filled the air. Why did enemies dread them so? Because the temple combined two arts rarely matched: rigid discipline and sacrificial resolve. Their marshals drilled eschils and assigned brothers to die to buy time, while sergeants and turcopoles screened flanks and prevented surprise. Horses were counted as a military chest, remount herds and forges kept squadrons ready to thunder twice in a day. Tactical patience broke rash frontal assaults, yet it also meant scarce reserves when the line failed. At Mansoura, that calculus cleaved into tragedy. Robert's charge plunged into an ambush, and the Templars who followed were cut to pieces. Only 5 survivors reached the main host. Their death on corners and bridges was not heroic theater but grim arithmetic, sacrifices to preserve column standards and the king. Jean de Joinville records how these deaths kept Louis IX himself from immediate capture, and how Templar marshals formed last mounted blocks at Farasker while the royal host dissolved into confusion. The consequence was twofold. Templars bought time and order with blood. They also taught their enemies lessons. The Mamluk slave officers watched the steady rearguard, the use of horse, foot, and engine, and they adapted quickly. These were not tribal levies, only they became a soldiery of pay, drill, and siegecraft. Where Templars once dominated by shock and reputation, they now faced professional captains raising engines and employing mines, countercharges, and disciplined reserves. In the Nile's heat, the order's strengths met new limits. Horses choked on hay and heat coffers strained under constant remounts, and the rule's demand for frontline courage could not supply infinite men. The capture of Louis at Farasker marked a hinge, a crusading king in chains and order exhausted, and an Egyptian military remade into something sharper. What would a black and white standard face next when enemies matched steel with engineering and coin with discipline? A storm of siegecraft and paid troops now gathers on the horizon, and the temple's old methods will be tested by machines and men who learned from their worst day. Acre, spring 1291. The sea breaks white against the mole while the harbor becomes a straining throat of souls. Women clutch bundles, boys push small boats, and the air tastes of salt and burning pitch. The city's outer walls smoke under a storm of stones and beams. Within the Templar quarter, the black and white standard still flew above the sea tower, a sight both rallying and ghastly to friend and foe. Who would hold the mole and who would reach the ships? The choice was grim and immediate. The Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu marshaled his knights to one duty: keep the lanes open to the water until the last boat slipped free. This was not a parade of lances, but a stern economy of violence. The brothers accepted casualty as calculus. Every cut or death bought time for the unarmed, and for the stores that would save the order's continuity. Marshal and sergeant tightened ranks. Squadrons formed short, brutal wedges, and then closed back into the gates, leaving gaps only long enough for a cart or a child to pass. They fought as they had been forged: discipline first, shock at the appointed moment. A Templar charge was not wild impetus, but a measured rupture. Lances couched horses, ridden to a rhythm practiced in years of drill. Banners held to fix a rally point, while foot servants sealed flanks. Their habit of combining monastic obedience with cavalry purpose produced an uncanny calm under slaughter. Opponents found it terrifying because the Templars would close a street, hold it with shields, and then, when ordered, explode through with the precision of a smith's hammer. Their enemies could not easily buy off that resolve, nor could panic scatter it. Logistics sustained this lethality. In Acre, the order still maintained forges, remounts, and granaries, allowing repeated sorties even as the siege ate at manpower. Mantlets were pushed ahead of ladders and carts, archers sheltered, then spilled arrow storms as the brothers rolled into the breach. The Templars' single-mindedness also hardened fear. They would not rouse for plunder, only for the rule and the living shield of non-combatants. This doctrine made them predictably dangerous at moments of crisis. Ibn al-Furat records that Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil brought to bear 100 siege engines and teams of sappers to batter the towers and sap the walls. Machines of that scale finally blunted the order's edge. The sea tower took hit after hit, and crumbled smoke and mason dust filled lanes already slippery with blood. Guillaume de Beaujeu, struck down among his brothers, bled beneath the walls as marshals closed ranks and men with rope and steel tried to force another lane to the quay. When the last horses were gone and the harbor jammed, the surviving Templars cast off for Cyprus with little more than their rule and their mantles. Around them, the Christian presence in the Levant dissolved like ash on wind. Their prowess had terrified enemies for nearly 2 centuries, but discipline and sacrifice could not outmatch overwhelming engines and numbers now. In the West, kings counted debts and envoys whispered a different siege by court and crown already gathered its shadow. In the ruined precinct of the Al-Aqsa Palace at Hierosalima, a small band knelt beneath low vaults, candlelight on mail, and the whisper of wool against iron. Hugues de Paynes led a compact fellowship who took vows to guard pilgrims along the highways to the holy places. They numbered 9, humble in means, yet precise in purpose, the black and white beauseant lifted in the dusty wind like a threat and a promise. Their beginnings were humble. 9 swore beneath the vaults. Sources vary, but within 10 years the militia Templi numbered perhaps 50 to 100 brethren. William of Tyre noted their austere rule and martial zeal. Why did such a scant company come to be feared across a region of many foes? Their decision was simple and severe: to bind monastic obedience to mounted warfare. At a council in Troyes their rule won papal sanction, and Bernard of Clairvaux praised this fusion of prayer and lance as a new model of spiritual knighthood. With that sanction came immunity from local dues and direct appeal to Rome, advantages that drew gifts and recruits from the West and turned alms into armor. They organized as a military household rather than a feudal retinue. Marshals taught form charges, sergeants guarded the banner, and the pilgrims remount herds, and smiths kept horse and iron serviceable beyond the city walls. In practice, this meant disciplined shock delivered by compact squadrons who couched lances together and held as a bank of steel, while lighter riders and local guides screened the flanks. A mantled brother might pray at dawn and ride at noon, the white mantle damp with sweat under its weight. On the road, they were the final refuge and the sharpest danger. Pilgrims trusted their escort, bandits and raiders learned to avoid the known crossing where the Temple brothers kept watch. In pitched fighting, the Templars sought the decisive shock, but they also perfected small unit discipline, orderly withdrawals, reformed ranks under missile fire, and close defense of baggage and wounded. Their esprit and rule produced patience under arrow storms and resolve in close quarrel. Enemies found it harder to rout a unit that refused to break. Their reputation spread by tongue and terror. Muslim commanders spoke of the white mantles and the black and white standard as if they were a single terrible instrument. Frankish lords learned that the brothers could hold a gap until levies reformed. Gifts from abbeys and nobles furnished stores and strongboxes that kept horses and engines functioning, while other hosts starved or dispersed. Yet their birth as an order left an enduring weakness. They were few where need was great, and pledged to obedience where politics demanded maneuver. Sacred sanction gave them identity, steel, and shelter, but it also bound them to a rule that could not always match the messy claims of crusader princes. As their dark banner took meaning across the Levant, wider struggles moved toward the north and east, where cities and counties awaited a stern and costly test. In the Latin East, in the decades before 1144, the Knights Templar transformed a monastic rule into a military temperament that bound prayer to saddle and chapel to forge. Under the marshal's horn, they practiced the close, repeated shock that made their name. Hooves thudded in formation, lances cooshed as one, a sound like a single iron wind. The rule prescribed order, chapel at dawn, arms inspection, and the foundry's fire. Even shoeing a horse could excuse a brother from mass, so that mounts were never neglected. Warehouses and remount herds became as holy as altars for horses, ate like small lords, and therefore determined strategy as much as piety. They organized themselves as an army within an army, knights at the point, sergeants holding the next line, and foot servants keeping the banner taut against the wind. Turcopoles screened the flanks and harried enemy scouts, a skin of speed around the heavy center. Marshals drilled echelons, tight ranks formed for ordered charge, and taught men to ride knee beside knee so that each impact was supported by brothers on either side. Discipline, not gamblers' bravado, made their charges recoverable. After one shock, they could reform, resupply, and strike a second and a second again. Their logistics scared enemies as much as their helmets did. Forges beat out new points for lances, smiths welded repairs by the hour when campaigns demanded. Stable boys tended remounts behind curtain walls so that a fallen horse did not end a brother's fight. The boscient black and white was not mere emblem but a rallying law. When it sank into a melee, levies steadied, and local counts who wavered found their men clinging to the Templar standard. William of Tyre later notes that the mere sight of their mantles could unman a foe's will. Hostile chroniclers agree the order's combination of discipline and supply altered the moral balance of fields. Papal and monastic sanction wrapped the order in authority. Bernard of Clairvaux hailed the new knighthood, and papal bulls granted privileges and revenues. Sources vary. By the 1130s, perhaps 300–700 knights, with roughly 2 sergeants or auxiliaries for each brother. Numbers mattered as much as discipline. Chapels rang with bells before dawn, trumpets answered in the stables, and the smell of tallow and hot iron mixed with incense when brothers set forth. Fulcher and Ibn al-Athir note their steadiness. Even Muslim commanders learned to fear the black and white, yet such fame would draw sharper trials. Yet their success bred sharper demands and sharper enemies. Their readiness encouraged frontal contests where space allowed, and punished all who trusted numbers over order. It also drew notice from rival powers who learned to counter shock with feigned retreat and archery. The Templars could pulverize a poorly led levy. Their commitment to fixed doctrine and few deep reserves made them brittle when lines were stretched, and surprises came from unexpected quarters. A soldier smelled oil and horse sweat before he felt the lance banners could rally men, but they could not eat a countryside stripped for fodder. What happens when a frontier that lives by patrol is faced with a crisis wider than one broken tower? In 1144, the fall of Edessa would answer that question and call the brothers from orderly parades and warehouses into a harsher, more urgent crucible. Across Anatolian ravines and snowbright, passes the crusading columns ground eastward Templar guides fastening ranks and urging steady cadence beneath arrow-racked skies. Odo of Duil records the constant choice between speed and caution, and how commanders argued when the road offered no easy answer. Papal bulls promised indulgentia to many nobles sought Gloria Dei, and earthly dignitas in equal measure. Bells and trumpets marked councils, incense stung nostrils where wounds festered, and the cold smelled of metal and sweat. Templar files threaded narrow defiles with practiced calm lances couched and shields overlapped to form a moving wall against sudden flight and feigned retreat. Arrows hissed through the cold air, a sound like iron rain that demanded instant order and ruthless discipline. Their doctrine blended monk and martial cloistered obedience, married to a marshal's horn daily prayer set beside horsemanship and the keeping of accounts. They trained to fight as a unit, brothers riding in close wedges, while dismounted sergeants closed ranks to protect banners and baggage. Turcopoles screened the flanks, scouting and skirmishing to blunt enemy horse archer swarms before the heavy squadrons struck. Warehouses remount herds and smithies followed the banner. Their wagons were repositories of food, spare bridles, and the iron that kept a charge coming. 3 squadrons of the order could hold a pass until footmen and pavises reached safety, a repeatable shock that terrified opponents who met it once. Yet machinery of war could not iron out nobles. Rivalries feud and honor split councils and turned careful plans into impromptu marches. In Syrian gardens, hedges became narrow killing lanes when princes disputed lodgings and lines. Gates stayed shut until bargains were signed, and the moment for unified action slipped away. Ibn al-Athir notes bitter words among Christian leaders and the way that local lords trusted their own banners more than any common cause. Sources vary. Some chronicles place the crusading host in the tens of thousands, which multiplied frictions over supply and precedence. The Templars patched ruptures with steel, hauling the wounded, holding a breach, or mounting a night sortie to drag a water supply back into camp. Their presence steadied levies whose courage bent like young saplings in wind when the Beaucient rode forward. Men gathered to its shade. Enemies learned to dread the order because it combined relentless shock with a monastic readiness to die. Brothers willingly took the hardest points so others might live. Still, rigid oath and strict drill could not substitute political judgment. A marshal could command steadiness, but vassals answered first to lords, not to a common will. Horses wasted on stony tracks, grain dwindled in sacks, and disease moved down columns faster than any cavalry. Morale, once frayed, unraveled far from any siege. Chroniclers later underline that iron discipline cannot repair divided councils, and that logistics, counsel, and unity decide more than courage alone. As the crusading momentum ebbed beneath Syrian skies, leaders turned eyes seaward to the coastal gateway at Ascalon, where a city's stones would test what men and orders could still achieve. Could the temple's discipline and the Beaucient steady a wall against engines, intrigue, and changing alliances? The answer waits beneath those battered stones, and the next siege will show. Ascalon 1153. Siege towers creak forward, while Mangonel's arc stones over the walls and smoke veils the sea wind. The king and his captains must take the port to secure the southern frontier, and the Templars resolve to lead storm parties into any breach. White mantles show like wounds in smoke as the brothers climb ladders beneath boiling oil and flaming arrows. Shields lock, lances brace, and horses strain at the ramp. William of Tyre notes that the Templar aggressiveness steadied wavering levies, though pride and haste could turn courage into ruin. A tower collapses under bombardment, defenders counterattack from the streets, and the brothers pay with blood, and lost mounts their standard dragging in the dust. The air tastes of pitch and copper, the sea wind brings salt, and the cough of smoke that hides friend and foe alike. Trumpets answer the mangonel's bells from the camp chapel, mark hours between assaults. Pilgrims who came as spectators cross themselves and press coin into the hands of sergeants before they are bidden back to wagons. The order moves like a small state remount, herds forges and granaries, keep riders on saddle and men fed. Turcopole's screen approach routes skirmishing to blunt missile fire and draw archers' sources, very attackers numbered perhaps 8,000,20, while defenders may have held 2,000,60. A marshal's horn calls drills where knights practice couching lances and falling back in order choreography learned under fasting and the rule. Templar discipline rests not only on faith, but on this web of logistics and ritual. Brothers bore psalms beneath mail, some carried tiny reliquaries for courage, small vexilla against fear. Human motives braided the field, the king sought a secure border, and fame barons sought land, and honor brothers sought gloria dei and indulgentia for sins. Fear was immediate, timor mortis, felt in the twitch of a steward counting horse rations as stones splinter timber. Chroniclers set the scene in terse lines. William of Tyre paraphrases the assault as a bold thrust that calmed the host. Arab annalists note smoke that hid the sea, and the smell of burning oil sources vary on exact detail. The temple sent storm parties in compact columns. Their aim was not glory alone, but to seize lodgements for the whole host. At Ascalon, this meant men and horses jammed into streets' alleys, turning to staccato combats amid smoke and collapsing beams. Losses are swift. Brothers who vow ascetic penance can still die in a moment, their vows sealing courage even as it consumes them. To the besieged, the sight of white mantles crashing into a breach chills resolve and quickens desperate sorties among rooftops and gardens. To enemies, the Templars seem inexorable, a blunt instrument of religious war whose shock arrives at the moment the line threatens to crack. Capturing Ascalon wins the city, but the frontier remains a knife-edge, supply lines thin and garrison numbers small. Who will hold those breaches when the towers rot and coin runs out? Soon patrols, not parades, will decide who drinks the Jordan. In the Upper Jordan in the mid-12th century, the Templars stretched their chain of stone from Gaza to Tortosa and set a new tooth at Vadam Iaqab to choke the Damascus road. Ashlar rose under sun, and Hammer patrols road reeds, and basalt the black and white Bosient stark against the Golan. The project was political, will made masonry a visible claim beyond the river, a forward shrine, and a threat that would force rivals to choose. The decision to push the line so far east came from strategy and rivalry. Baldwin of Jerusalem would not sell the crossing to Saladin. The temple accepted the task of garrison and construction, because their order bound them to hold pilgrim routes and to project martial monastic power. Papal bulls and promises of indulgentia lent moral weight to fortification and to those who gave coin. William of Tyre later notes that the fortress was entrusted to the brethren who raised walls with their own labor, and with civilian masons and captives at the foundations. Could a fresh tooth of stone stop a sultan? That question hardened every planning table. When Saladin answered, he turned fieldcraft to baited trap and sapping alike. His horsemen harried supply convoys, while engineers worked against the half-finished defenses. Miners dug beneath the masonry, and engines sent showers of bolts and stones. Trumpets and the smell of pitch mixed with the river reeds' bells in distant villages told brief warnings. The Templars defended by strict formations, cavalry, ready to charge, footmen in close rank, sergeants watching the banner. Attackers crept forward behind mantlets, arrow sleet hummed, and the reek of smoke hung in the ford. The garrison, which sources estimate at 1,500 men, included a heavy portion of laborers, men who were by trade masons rather than veterans, and this made the defense brittle. Sources vary. Masons may have been as much as 1/3 of the occupants, reducing the ratio of seasoned knights to workmen. Beyond tactics lay pride and dread. For the brethren, the white mantle was not only protection, but vow they feared disgrace as much as death. For Saladin, victory here would answer more than strategy. It would close a road, protect pilgrims bound for Damascus, and burn the reputation of the Franks. In camp by night his officers spoke of honor and prudence. Men prayed and read psalms, men of every tongue seeking consolation before battle. The siege tightened and turned to slaughter when the tunnel's fire undermined a corner of the unfinished wall. William of Tyre describes dawn's breach and the massacre that followed. At dawn, the assailants burst the gap, and the defenders were cut down amid smoke and screams. Master Odo's capture at nearby Marge Ion had warned of divided Frankish responses. Here help from Tiberias came too late. The castle, more worksite than citadel, bled coin and brothers' dead horses, lay tangled with shattered lances in the mud at the ford. The sight of white mantles rent and fallen gave Saladin a new fearful name in every frontier market. For the Templars, the loss taught a bitter lesson about projection and logistics. A forward post demands not only stone and will, but depth of supply reserves and prompt relief. The garrison's fate spread dread through nearby castles and towns, and it reshaped Saladin's plans for the next campaign. The road was no longer merely contested. It had become an avenue of war whose next turn might close a castle or open a city to siege. Acre and Arsuf on the Levantan coast during the Crusade led by King Richard of England became a workshop of war where piety was measured in timbers and tar as much as in prayer. Around Acre's double harbor trenches and palisades knitted into a lattice of siegeworks, mangonels heaved stones, Petri spat dust, and shipwrights cut keels into supply barges. Sources vary, but chronicles suggest 8 to 12 mangonels worked the approaches. Templar masters marshaled carpenters and forges, turning alms into iron, and 100 carts creaked along the mole with fresh horses' tackle and salted wheat. The air smelled of salt spray, and hot iron mail clinked under white mantles, and a steady drum of repairs kept the blackened white banner from collapsing into mere legend. Pilgrim processions still came each dawn, relics wrapped and blessed, while papal indulgentia and bulls tightened the resolve of many who fought. Ambrose records their drills and the hush before sallies, noting how the temple's halls counted animals, not just prayers, and how organization became a weapon in itself. William of Tyre records siege smoke mingled with prayer. Their fighting was not mere zealotry, but a doctrine of restraint and timing. In camp, they trained to couch lances together, to ride knee to knee in a single breath, and to hold lines until the moment chosen. Turcopoles screened the flanks and drew enemy skirmishers into the teeth of the main body. Foot sergeants protected the banner while marshals readied reserves. On the plain at Arsuf, King Richard reined his men, forbidding rash pursuit until the line could hold. Then the temple squadrons thundered forward, lances lowered as a single roof of iron their charge, not a wild storm, but a planned hammer blow. The sound was of hooves like a tide breaking shields, rang Mamluk formation splintered, and riders and remounts carried momentum home. Opponents came to dread that measured release more than any impetuous outburst. The timed thunder left little to rally behind. Their terror in the field grew from habit and infrastructure as much as from training. The order's stores at Acre and its harbor fleet fed horses and smiths, making repeated charges feasible where ordinary baronial retinues would wilt after the first clash. Their discipline created a psychological weapon. Enemies feared the silent reserve as much as the visible spear. Yet that terror had limits. At Acre, siege engines and disease, the politics between kings and the thinness of supply, constrained how far the temple could push, and at Arsuf, the victory owed to allied command as much as to Templar courage. Chroniclers felt the tug of glory and grief. Uzama ibn Munki and Ibn al-Athir write of dread and respect in different keys. The chroniclers later note glories and losses in differing registers, figures vary, and memory sharpened into legend. What the Templars taught friend and foe was simple and dangerous war could be engineered. The black and white standard remained a signal for order and for sudden violence, but the coast's gains left Jerusalem unresolved. Acre was won, yet the inland city waited its fate, tied to fragile truces, fleets, and grain convoys. Supply lines thinned, kings argued over ransom and command, and a new campaign, political as much as military, loomed on the horizon. Coastal Syria under Baybars became a map of threatened towers, and lonely roads the frontier narrowing into a series of isolated stones. The Sultan's strategy was brutal clarity: cut the links to Acre, seize the coastal posts, and deny the Franks any depth to rally from. Engines and mining parties took the place of pitched battle, where resources were thin and horses already exhausted. Baybars moved with engineers' mangonels and a willingness to bargain or brutalize whichever opened a gate. Papal bulls urged relief and indulgentia for crusading, yet Western princes answered slowly. Naval convoys rarely exceeded 20 to 30 ships, sources vary. Templar castles answered as they had for a century, fortified and fierce, but their choices were narrowing. They held towers, trained squadrons, and still launched sorties to break a siege. They could not, however, gather the reserves to challenge a sultan who now fought with paid, drilled troops and an expanding mastery of siege craft. Where cavalry once decided fields, engines now decided walls. Coin-thinned remounts grew scarce, and the black and white mantles more often stood behind battlements than under the sun. Underground, the war took a new breath. Templar sappers listened by oil lamp for the faint echo of Mamluk picks. The oil lamp smoke hung like a small cloud, and the hollow clink of iron was the order of battle there. Ibn al-Athir records the sappers' patient toil: mangonels creaked, pitch stank, and bells were muffled in prayer. Mines were a question of patience and faith when pick met keystone which would break first, wall or will. Ibn letter 2 bf, a bd al letter 1e93a macron hir records assaults ordered with promises to garrisons, offers of quarter, followed swiftly by chains when stones fell. Safed fell after such labors. The towers, lightning sketched against the night, were no refuge when countermines failed and engines battered a breach. The Templars fought by sortie and countermine throwing, mounted charges from hurtling courtyards into the soft arc of the besiegers' lines. These sorties steadied local levies and bought time for civilians to flee toward the ships. Yet when walls cracked, the chroniclers later recall, garrisons were enslaved or slain. Mercy depended on whether surrender came before the breach. Along the coast, Atlet called Shade al Pellerin and Tortosa held because the sea kept them breathing. Ships brought grain, men, and hoped their harbors became lifelines. Inland castles received fewer succors. The Great Stone at Beaufort was defended by only 480 fighting men, when it was tested, a figure that shows how spare the order's manpower had become. Horses, the heart of their charge, were often spent or unavailable for long campaigns. The order's reputation remained a weapon. Their disciplined couche-lance charges, the mounted blocks carved to buy an infantry withdrawal, and their willingness to die at a breach still made enemies fear them. But fear did not repair undermined foundations, replenish coin chests, or replace a broken remount herd. Baybars, hammer continued to fall along the marches, while the sea alone kept some towers alive. Local barons hesitated, pressed by debts and dynastic cares. Ambition and fear clouded unified action. If the coast's chain could be snapped piece by piece, what would save Acre when siege engines and trained Mamluk troops came to weigh every stone?